of 1 Peter. We've just heard part of it there. And it's mostly been James. I think it's entirely been James, actually. And he spoke to us about being born again. And then he spoke to us that we then, having been born into new life, we can grow into new life. And then last week, we talked about finding that thing, that allegiance to a thing that is worth giving everything to. And that new life is that thing that's worth it, that Jesus is the one worth committing to. All of that is very good. If you've not heard it, we do have them all on YouTube. You can go, and don't do it now. It'd be really distracting for the people around you. But later on, go on YouTube, have a look, have a listen to those, because they're good. And then today, we're going to expand on this idea of allegiance and commitment. But I'm going to ask, what happens when our commitment to God makes things difficult? Because the passage that we've just heard, it opens with this really interesting contradiction. On the one hand, no one can hurt you if you do good. Excellent. That's reassuring. When you suffer for doing good, hang on, Peter. You just said you won't, and now you're saying you will. Thanks. A little bit confusing. And so I thought that's the bit that caught me, that he says you can't suffer when you do good. When you do suffer for it, here's what you should do. And so I thought we need to have a look at that. Peter's letters, 1 Peter, 2 Peter, are written towards the end of his life. Tradition tells us, because this is not specifically in the Gospels or Acts, but tradition tells us that Peter was crucified during the time of the Emperor Nero, which was kind of this huge period of persecution in the 60s. Lots of Christians dying. It's about 30 years after Jesus. And by this point, the church, the fledgling young church, is fairly well established around the Mediterranean. There are churches all over the place, in Corinth and in Rome and in Ephesus and throughout Asia Minor. And, the church has expanded. It has grown. And this particular letter is written to a group of churches in Asia Minor, which nowadays we would just call Turkey. And it's there to encourage them, because the church at this point is experiencing persecution as a fact of life. If you are a Christian at this time, it is likely that you are going to be persecuted. This is the period where Peter is put to death because of his faith. Paul is going to be put to death because of his faith. Many others, quite a lot of the disciples, are going to be put to death because of their faith. In a few years, the Romans, after Peter's letter, in a few years, the Romans are going to respond to this big uprising of Jewish rebellion by flattening the temple and clearing the top of Temple Mount and repressing what's going on. And I know that the temple is the Jewish thing. It's not. We don't worry about the temple so much. But bear in mind that at this point in time, and actually still, if you're being technical about it, Christianity is a Jewish sect. It's a bunch of Jewish people going, aha, that Messiah that we've been waiting for thousands of years, that's Jesus. He is that Messiah. Hurrah! Christianity is that extension of Judaism. But if you're an annoyed Roman who's trying to put down a rebellion, you're not really that fussed. They're all just God believers. So you're going to persecute them just in case. And I think this is what Peter's getting at. Doing good shouldn't bring suffering upon you. You shouldn't suffer for doing good, but you might. In fact, you probably will, particularly in his time. But even now, you might. But if you do good and you suffer, it doesn't invalidate the good that you just did. The value of your actions is not determined by the reception that they receive. Or, if you want a slightly more concrete way of looking at that, toddlers. Now, I'm going to come in here and say I am under no illusions. I do not perfectly parent. I'm not the greatest, but I think I've got a grasp on the basics. You're meant to give them food, change the nappy every day or so, make sure they're dressed before they leave the house. Dressed as a dinosaur still counts. They're still dressed. That's fine. The basics. I'm down on that. But every now and then, based on feedback from my toddlers, I will do something that is irredeemably stupid. For example, I might offer them Cheerios for breakfast. I might pick a non-Spider-Man top because all the with Spider-Man tops are in the wash because they get worn a lot. And the reaction to these things, if I offer Cheerios for breakfast or if I offer, but it's got the Incredible Hulk on it, it's not Spider-Man, tends to be, he's never even seen Spider-Man. I have to get this off my chest. He's never seen Spider-Man. He's never watched any of the movies, read any of the comics. He's never seen Spider-Man on telly, but if he doesn't get to wear Spider-Man 2 or 3 times a week, he's very upset. I don't know why. On the other hand, he is a cool superhero, so it's okay. I just don't know where it comes from. Anyway, I completely lost. I just had to say that out loud. It's not even in my notes. I just needed to say it. So the thing is, when these things happen, we get this really dramatic response. We get the tears, and the Ezra's current thing is that he will just do this. And he will just stay there for a couple of minutes to indicate his displeasure. And then he'll forget about it and go and do something else. And we get all this kind of, I don't want Cheerios. And it's very dramatic. But the thing is, I have to kind of fall back on trying to feed and clothe my children, I think is still a good thing. Despite that response, I'm going to carry on trying to feed and clothe them. I don't stop doing them just because it makes my life more difficult. Although sometimes it is very tempting just to serve them cheese for breakfast. It's my favourite. If Reuben had his way, he'd have 2 slices of cheese for breakfast. He'd have 2 slices of cheese for lunch. And he'd have pesto pasta for tea. And I probably shouldn't have said that because he can hear me next door. We're not having pesto pasta for tea if you're listening. That would make my life easier. I could just let him wear the Spider-Man top until it was, solid and stood up on its own. And that would make my life easier, but it wouldn't be the right thing to do because it wouldn't be the good thing. I should stick with the good thing no matter how it is received. And that's what Peter's saying. Stick with it. Stick with what is good. And he dips into Isaiah to reinforce that point. We only get a couple of lines. You saw them on the first slide with the quote marks. That was a reference to Isaiah. But if you go and look at that particular bit and look at the wider context, Isaiah is hearing from God and he is repeating a warning where God has said to him, do not follow the people around you. They are going to worry about the plans of other people. They are going to worry about the schemes of other people. But you should not be afraid of those things. Do not worry about the plans and schemes of others because God is all-powerful. God is the place of safety for those who follow him. And Peter knows that, he's heard that, and he draws it into his and says, this is true now. At the end of the day, the things that we do are not done to impress other people. So if they're not impressed, it doesn't really matter. And this is a really critical point to Peter. It's so critical that he hits it again a couple of verses later. He says, it is better to suffer for doing good than for doing wrong. Again, the implication here is that we are going to suffer. You're going to suffer one way or the other. Whatever you do, good or wrong, you are going to suffer. If you do wrong, well, yeah, you can expect to face the consequences of that wrongdoing. But if you do right, you may still find yourself on the receiving end of an angry master or an irate Roman soldier or whatever. And Peter's thinking here is, well, look, if you're going to get in trouble anyway, you might as well get in trouble for doing good. And I think that sounds odd because it's very countercultural to us in the world that we live in. I think we're often presented with the attitude that if consequences are coming, then we might as well go out in a blaze of glory and excess. If we're going to get in trouble anyway, we should lean into it. We should really enjoy ourselves while we can. We should, stick it to the man and his rules. You'll never take us alive, copper. We should just go all in. If I'm going to eat one piece of chocolate, I might as well eat the bar. I've already eaten the one piece. I might as well take the lot. If I'm going to go 1 mile over the speed limit, I might as well go 10. It's illegal. Don't do it. But that's the mentality. If I'm breaking the rule a little bit, I'm already in trouble. So I might as well be in trouble for the whole thing now. I think it's because to that mentality, the idea of suffering for our actions kind of becomes an excuse. I don't need to behave well. I don't need to do good if I'm going to suffer anyway. What's the point? But the thing with that, the underlying problem with that, is what it says is we only do good because we're worried that we're going to get caught and we're going to get in trouble if we do otherwise. I can't do bad because bad gets me in trouble, therefore I have to do good. I only do what I do because I don't want to be told off, not because I really want to do the thing that I'm doing. And thus, if I'm getting told off anyway, whatever, I'm being told off now, I might as well do what I want. But I think that's a completely alien concept to Peter. Because I think in Peter's thinking, doing good is the end. Doing good is the point in and of itself. It's what Jesus did. And if Jesus did it, then it's the goal for anyone who claims to follow Jesus. And then what happens around that, the consequences, persecution, suffering, that all becomes irrelevant. Because if you did good, you've done good. Well done. That's the point. In fact, we can go even further. If you suffer for doing good, then you are walking in the footsteps of Jesus. Because that's what happened to him. Jesus was guiltless, but he still suffered. He acted out of a complete and unconditional love, but he still suffered. He did everything right, but still suffered. And so if we suffer for doing good, great. We're a little bit closer to Jesus than we were before. Now you might be thinking, how does any of this actually apply to me? Because we do not live in first century Mediterranean. It doesn't work as a sentence, but you know what I mean. Peter writes to a really different world to us. Well, actually, he writes to a different world to us, to the one that we live in. There are people in this world right now where I think a lot of what Peter says about persecution would have a far more immediate and relevant application. It would mean very different things to some Christians in the world at the moment than it does to us. And I think we are fortunate. We are fortunate that we don't live in countries where we're going to face serious persecution for our faith. But that lack of persecution doesn't change Peter's message. I think it just makes it slightly easier for us to put it into practice. Think of it as living for an audience of one. Now, Jesus alludes to this idea at various points in the Gospels. So in John chapter 5, verse 30, he says, "I seek not to please myself, but him who sent me." It's God who is my audience, says Jesus. Or in Matthew 6, in the middle of the Sermon on the Mount, we get those 3 repeated stories about giving and prayer and fasting, where Jesus says, don't do these things in front of other people. Don't spectate. Look at me, I'm putting money in the offering, everyone. Ooh. Look at me, I'm praying on the high street. Look at me, I'm fasting. You can tell because I haven't shaved for 2 days. Ooh. Jesus says, don't do that. Doesn't matter whether other people see you giving or praying or fasting. What matters is whether God sees you giving and praying and fasting. You do this for God and for God alone. He is the audience of one. Now, I'm not saying do good because God is watching you. Like God is Big Brother in the 1984 sense, not the TV. That's not the point. God is not there looming over us, inspecting constantly, watching us, waiting for us to trip up. And anyway, he doesn't need to because God knows everything anyway. God already knows. God knows everything that I say and do. But the thing is, the fact that I know that God knows everything that I say and do hasn't always stopped me from saying and doing things that I then wish that I had not done or said. And yet I'm still here. I've not yet been smoted by God. Still going. Because God is not an idiot. God knows that we mess up. God knows that we get things wrong. And that's why he forgives us. You know, me getting things wrong, not always doing good things, doesn't change God's love for me. So I don't need to do good just because God is watching. What I'm saying is that we should just forget that everyone else is watching. Don't assess your actions on whether or not they're going to enhance your social standing, or they're going to make a really good story later on, or it's going to avoid getting into a difficult conversation or a situation. Don't say to yourself, what will people think if I do this? Instead, we could say to ourselves, am I about to do good? Am I about to do what Jesus would do if he were here instead of me? Am I acting out of an unselfish, Christ-like love? And if the answer to that is yes, then do it. Worry about the consequences later. Or don't worry about them at all. Like Isaiah said, do not fear what the people fear. This is a headspace thing. This is about how we think, because all of us are capable of doing good. All of us can do good. These are not difficult things to do. Being good is not intrinsically difficult. I'm not asking anyone to fly or to swim the channel. Just doing good is a doable thing. But I think the reason that we don't do it is us. Because we get in our own way. We talk ourselves out of it. We anticipate that there's going to be a problem even before there is a problem. We convince ourselves that there's going to be backlash or ridicule, or someone's going to laugh, or we're going to be left feeling uncomfortable, or there's going to be something bad's going to happen as a consequence of a thing that we haven't even done yet, because we're worried about the bad thing that's going to happen when we do the thing that we're no longer going to do because of the bad thing that isn't going to happen because we're not going to do the thing. And then we don't do it. And I think what I want to say is, don't do that. Take hold of your thoughts. Recognize that the fear that is within them is not from God. And then put that down. Because we don't need it. We don't need it. In a nutshell, I think that is my challenge to all of us this morning. That the next time we're about to talk ourselves out of doing good, don't. Face the fear, trust in God, who is our place of safety, and then do it anyway. And then do it again and again and again as opportunity arises. In John 16, which is part of Jesus' huge long speech to the disciples between the Last Supper and the Garden of Gethsemane in John. And looking ahead, Jesus says this about difficult times that are on the horizon. He says, in this world, you will have trouble. In this world, you will have trouble, but take heart. Take heart, because I have overcome the world. back that one up. We'll try that again. Jesus says, in this world you will have trouble, but take heart. And I've heard this spoken about. And someone said, we take the phrase take heart as a very kind of, take heart, everyone, take heart. And he said, I don't think that's how Jesus says it. This is Jesus saying, take heart, be bold, be strong, for I have overcome the world. And I wonder how often Peter returns to those words over the years. I suspect it's more than once. I suspect every now and then he goes back and says, yes. I remember when Jesus told me he'd overcome, and then I saw him do it. I saw him die, and I saw him rise again, and I saw him ascend. And I know that he lives in heaven. And I know that he has overcome. And so I take heart. I think those words can still speak to us now. I think whatever we do, wherever we go, we are going to encounter suffering. But let's not live in fear. Instead, let's commit to doing good. To do good at all times, in all ways, no matter the cost. Because we know Jesus, and he has overcome. Let's pray. Lord, I thank you that we can take heart in you, that we can live in your victory, and that we can live without fear. Lord, lead us into doing good, to doing the good that you would do, the good that you are doing and have done. Show us how to walk and to act and to speak and to live as you lived and would have us live. Lord, help us to do good in your name without worrying, without being afraid, without fear. Lord, help us to live like you for your kingdom and for your glory.